The morning sun cast
No,
long
this
shadows
cannot
across the
proceed.
marble steps of Rosenberg Palace as Princess Elena adjusted her navy blue coat and checked her watch for the third time. She had arrived 15 minutes early for the monthly family council meeting, a tradition that had been maintained for over 2 centuries in the kingdom of Valdoria. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves from the palace gardens, and Elena breathed deeply, trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building in her chest since dawn. Elena had always been punctual, a trait inherited from her late mother, Queen Margaret, who had passed away 3 years prior. As the king's sister and second in line to the throne, Elena took her responsibilities seriously. She had spent the previous evening reviewing agricultural reports from the northern provinces and preparing her recommendations for the upcoming harvest festival celebrations. The people of Aldoria looked forward to this annual event, and Elena wanted everything to be perfect. As she approached the grand entrance of the palace, Elena noticed something unusual. The normally open golden doors were closed, and 2 guards stood at attention on either side. This was strange, as family members typically had unrestricted access to the palace, especially on council meeting days. Elena had grown up running through these halls, playing hide and seek with Alexander when they were children. The palace had always felt like home to her. She walked up to the guards with a warm smile, expecting them to step aside and open the doors as they had done countless times before. Instead, they remained perfectly still, their expressions neutral but firm. Elena's smile faltered slightly as she approached the older of the 2 guards, Sergeant Morrison, whom she had known since she was a teenager. "Good morning, Sergeant Morrison," Elena said pleasantly. "Beautiful day for a council meeting, isn't it?" Sergeant Morrison's face remained impassive, though Elena could see a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," he replied formally. "I'm afraid I have instructions regarding your entry today." Elena's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Instructions? What kind of instructions?" She let out a small laugh, assuming this was some sort of misunderstanding. "The family council meeting is scheduled for 10 o'clock. I'm a bit early, but surely that's not a problem." The sergeant shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving slightly toward the communication device on his belt. "Your Royal Highness, I've been instructed to inform you that your presence is not required at today's meeting. Queen Isabel has made arrangements for your absence." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She took a step back, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. Queen Isabel, who had married her brother Alexander 2 years ago, had somehow arranged for her to be excluded from a family council meeting. Elena had never missed a council meeting in her adult life, not even when she had been recovering from pneumonia the previous winter. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake," Elena said, her voice remaining steady despite the shock coursing through her veins. "I am Princess Elena of Valdoria, sister to His Majesty King Alexander. I have every right to attend this meeting." Sergeant Morrison looked genuinely pained as he replied, "I understand, Your Royal Highness, and I sincerely apologize for this situation. However, my orders come directly from Queen Isabel's office. She has specifically requested that you be informed the meeting has been rescheduled and that your attendance is not necessary today." Elena felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Several palace staff members were moving about their morning duties, and she could sense curious glances being cast in her direction. This was not just a denial of entry. It was a public humiliation. In all her 35 years, Elena had never been treated with such disrespect within the walls of her family home. And what reason did Queen Isabel give for this rescheduling? Elena asked, her voice taking on a sharper edge despite her efforts to remain composed. The sergeant's discomfort was becoming more apparent. He glanced at his colleague, and then back at Elena. "I wasn't provided with specific reasons, Your Royal Highness. I was simply told that the Queen would handle all communications regarding the change in schedule." Elena's mind was racing. This made no sense whatsoever. Alexander had called her personally just 3 days ago to confirm her attendance and to discuss several important matters that required her input. They had talked about the upcoming trade negotiations with the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, and Elena had prepared extensive notes on the cultural considerations that would be crucial for successful diplomatic relations. "May I speak with my brother directly?" Elena asked, pulling out her mobile phone. "Surely the king can clarify this confusion." "I'm afraid His Majesty is already in session with the Queen and other advisors," Sergeant Morrison replied. "No interruptions are permitted during active council proceedings." Elena stared at the closed doors, her reflection visible in the polished brass handles. She had walked through these doors hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. They had never been closed to her before. The symbolism was not lost on her. She was being literally shut out of her family's business, her kingdom's affairs, and her rightful place in the royal hierarchy. The rational part of Elena's mind told her to remain calm, to avoid creating a scene that would undoubtedly become palace gossip within the hour. "I simply cannot comprehend why I would be excluded from a family meeting without any prior notice or explanation. This is highly irregular." The sergeant's expression softened slightly. "I understand your confusion, Your Royal Highness. If it were up to me," he trailed off, clearly unable to complete the thought without insubordination. Elena appreciated his position. She knew that Sergeant Morrison was following orders, and she would not put him in an impossible situation by pressing further. However, she also knew that she could not simply walk away without understanding what was happening. "Is there perhaps someone from Queen Isabel's staff who could speak with me?" Elena asked. "Someone who might have more information about this change in schedule." "Lady Catherine might be available," the sergeant suggested, referring to Queen Isabel's chief, lady-in-waiting. "She was here earlier this morning, though I'm not certain of her current location." Elena nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Sergeant Morrison. I appreciate your patience and professionalism during this unusual situation." As Elena turned away from the entrance, she felt a complex mixture of emotions swirling within her. Confusion dominated her thoughts. What could have prompted such a drastic action? Hurt followed closely behind. How could Alexander allow this to happen without speaking to her first? And underneath it all was a growing sense of unease about the changing dynamics within the royal family since Isabel's arrival. Elena had initially welcomed Isabel into the family with open arms. She had been genuinely happy for Alexander, who had seemed lighter and more joyful after their marriage. Isabel appeared intelligent, charming, and dedicated to her role as queen. However, over the past several months, Elena had begun to notice subtle changes in how palace affairs were being handled. Small things at first. Elena's opinions being sought less frequently on matters where her expertise was valuable. Her traditional role in planning state dinners being gradually transferred to other staff members. Her access to certain palace areas requiring new approvals that had never been necessary before. Each incident on its own seemed minor, perhaps even reasonable, as Isabel settled into her role as queen. But, taken together, they formed a pattern that Elena was beginning to recognize. As she walked through the palace gardens, Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from her longtime friend and confidant, Lady Sarah, who served as Elena's private secretary and had been planning to attend the meeting with her. "Where are you? The meeting started 10 minutes ago, and there's no sign of you in the council chamber. Is everything all right?" Elena stared at the message, her confusion deepening. If the meeting had indeed started as scheduled, then the story about rescheduling was clearly false. She had been deliberately excluded, and lies had been told to facilitate that exclusion. This was far more serious than a simple scheduling conflict. Elena's fingers hovered over her phone as she considered how to respond to Sarah. How could she explain that she had been denied entry to her own family's meeting? How could she admit that she had been standing outside the palace like a common visitor, turned away by guards acting on orders from her sister-in-law? The gardens around her were peaceful and beautiful, the late morning sun filtering through the golden autumn leaves. Gardeners worked quietly among the flower beds, and the fountain at the center of the rose garden provided a gentle, soothing sound. This place had always been Elena's sanctuary, somewhere she could think clearly and find perspective during difficult times. Elena decided to text Sarah back, slight delay. "Please take notes on everything discussed. We'll explain later." It wasn't entirely truthful, but it would buy Elena time to figure out what was really happening and how to address it appropriately. She needed to understand the full scope of the situation before taking any action that might make things worse. As Elena settled onto her favorite bench beside the rose garden, she began to mentally review the events of the past few weeks, searching for clues that might explain this morning's shocking treatment. She thought about her last conversation with Alexander, tried to remember if there had been any tension or unusual undertones. She considered her recent interactions with Isabel, wondering if she had unknowingly said or done something to cause offense. The more Elena thought about it, the more convinced she became that this was not about her behavior or any specific incident. This felt deliberate and calculated, as if someone had been planning to marginalize her role within the royal family structure. The question was whether Alexander was aware of what was happening in his name, or if he was being kept in the dark about his sister's treatment. Elena's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Alexander's name, and for a moment, her heart leaped with relief. He was calling to explain the misunderstanding, to invite her to join the meeting after all, to apologize for the confusion. She answered quickly, "Alexander, thank goodness. I was just Elena, where are you?" Alexander's voice sounded stressed and slightly annoyed. "The meeting started 20 minutes ago, and Sarah said you had some kind of delay. What's going on?" Elena was silent for a moment, processing the implications of his question. If Alexander was asking where she was, then he clearly expected her to be at the meeting, which meant he had no idea that she had been turned away at the door. "Alexander," Elena said carefully, "I'm in the gardens. I was denied entry to the palace this morning by the guards. They said they had instructions from Isabel that I was not to attend today's meeting." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that Elena wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice filled with confusion and what sounded like anger. "They what?" "Elena, that's impossible. I never gave any such instructions, and Isabel wouldn't." He trailed off, and Elena could hear muffled voices in the background. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you right now." The line went dead, leaving Elena staring at her phone with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that Alexander clearly had not intended for her to be excluded. Apprehension about what this meant for his marriage and for the stability of the royal family. Elena remained on the bench, watching the gardeners tend to the roses and trying to prepare herself for what would undoubtedly be a very difficult conversation. Whatever was happening in the palace, whatever forces were at work to undermine her position, Elena knew that the next few minutes would be crucial in determining how the situation would be resolved. The sound of quick footsteps on the gravel path announced Alexander's arrival before Elena saw him. When he came into view, his face was flushed with anger, and his usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, as if he had rushed out of the meeting without regard for protocol. "Elena, I am so sorry," Alexander said as he reached her bench. "I had no idea. This is completely unacceptable." Looking at her brother's distressed face, Elena felt some of her anger begin to fade, replaced by concern for what this incident might mean for all of them. The real question was no longer what had happened, but why it had happened and what they were going to do about it. Hashtag Royal Drama Story. Part 2. Alexander sat down heavily beside Elena on the garden bench, running his hands through his dark hair in a gesture she remembered from their childhood, whenever he was deeply troubled. The October breeze rustled the remaining leaves on the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel over the palace grounds for centuries, and Elena could see the tension in every line of her brother's body. "Tell me exactly what happened," Alexander said, his voice barely controlled. "Every detail from the moment you arrived." Elena recounted the morning's events carefully, watching as Alexander's expression grew progressively darker. She described the guards' behavior, their obvious discomfort with the situation, and the specific wording they had used regarding Isabel's instructions. As she spoke, Elena noticed that Alexander's hands were clenched into fists, and a muscle in his jaw was twitching, a sign of barely restrained fury that she hadn't seen since they were teenagers. "Sergeant Morrison said the orders came directly from Isabel's office," Elena concluded. He seemed genuinely sorry about the situation, but he was clearly following explicit instructions. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring across the gardens toward the palace. Elena could practically see the thoughts racing through his mind as he processed what she had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. I need to understand something, Elena. In the past few months, have there been other incidents? Other times when you felt excluded or marginalized? Elena hesitated. She had been hoping to avoid this conversation, partly because she hadn't wanted to cause problems between Alexander and Isabel, and partly because she had been telling herself that her concerns might be unfounded. But, given what had just happened, it seemed important to be completely honest. There have been some changes, Elena admitted slowly. Nothing as dramatic as this morning, but, yes, there have been incidents. Alexander turned to face her fully, his blue eyes intense. What kind of incidents? Elena took a deep breath and began to explain. She told him about how her traditional role in planning state dinners had been gradually transferred to other staff members, with Isabel citing a desire to modernize the process. She described how her input on cultural and diplomatic matters had been sought less frequently, despite her extensive education and experience in international relations. Last month, Elena continued, I was supposed to represent the royal family at the opening of the new children's hospital in Westmont. It's exactly the kind of event I've handled for years. 3 days before the ceremony, Isabel's office called to inform me that my services wouldn't be needed, that she would be attending instead. Alexander's frown deepened. I remember that event. Isabel told me you had a scheduling conflict. I had no scheduling conflict, Elena said firmly. I cleared my entire week specifically for that event. The hospital had been planning my visit for months. When I tried to call Isabel's office to clarify, I was told that the decision was final and that all questions should be directed to Lady Catherine. As Elena continued to recount other incidents, she could see the realization dawning in Alexander's eyes. The pattern that she had been reluctant to acknowledge was becoming undeniably clear to him. Each individual incident might have been explained away as a simple change in protocol or a minor misunderstanding, but together they painted a picture of systematic exclusion. Why didn't you tell me about any of this before? Alexander asked, though his tone was more hurt than angry. Elena sighed. Because I hoped I was imagining things. Because I didn't want to cause problems in your marriage. Because every time I thought about bringing it up, it seemed petty and paranoid. She looked directly at her brother. Alexander, you're happier than I've ever seen you. Isabel makes you laugh in a way that you haven't since before Mother died. I didn't want to be the jealous sister-in-law who couldn't accept the new queen. Alexander reached over and took Elena's hand. You're not jealous or petty. You're my sister, and you have every right to expect respect and inclusion in this family. What happened this morning is completely unacceptable, and I need to understand how we got to this point. Before Elena could respond, they heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Both siblings looked up to see Queen Isabel approaching, accompanied by Lady Catherine and 2 of Isabel's personal guards. Elena felt her stomach clench with anxiety as she watched Isabel's measured approach. The Queen's expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in her green eyes that Elena couldn't quite identify. Isabel was undeniably beautiful, with auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon and wearing a burgundy dress that perfectly complemented her complexion. She moved with the grace that came from years of ballet training in her youth, and her posture suggested complete confidence. However, Elena noticed that Isabel's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, suggesting that she was not as calm as she appeared. Alexander, Isabel said as she reached the bench, her voice warm and concerned. I've been looking everywhere for you. The council members are wondering when you'll return to the meeting. Alexander stood slowly, and Elena could see the tension in his movements. The meeting is suspended until we resolve this situation, he said evenly. Isabel's eyebrows rose in an expression of innocent confusion that Elena suspected was carefully practiced. What situation? I'm afraid I don't understand. Don't you? Alexander's voice was deceptively calm, but Elena could hear the steel underneath. Perhaps you could explain why my sister was denied entry to the palace this morning on your orders. For just a moment, Elena saw something flicker across Isabel's face. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe annoyance that the plan had been discovered. But it was gone so quickly that Elena wasn't entirely certain she had seen it all. I think there's been some sort of misunderstanding, Isabel said, looking genuinely perplexed. I never gave any orders regarding Elena's attendance at the meeting. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Either Isabel was an extremely accomplished liar, or someone else was acting in her name without her knowledge. Both possibilities were deeply troubling. The guard specifically said the instructions came from your office, Elena said quietly. Sergeant Morrison was very clear about that. Isabel turned toward Elena with what appeared to be genuine concern. Elena, I'm so sorry you went through that experience. There must have been some terrible miscommunication. Lady Catherine, do you know anything about this? Lady Catherine, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent gray eyes, looked genuinely confused. Your Majesty, I have no record of any instructions regarding Princess Elena's attendance at today's meeting. In fact, I prepared her usual briefing materials yesterday evening. Elena watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. If both Isabel and Lady Catherine were telling the truth, then who had given the orders to exclude her? And if one of them was lying, which one was it and why? Alexander's expression had shifted from anger to careful scrutiny. Elena knew that look. It was the same expression he wore when reviewing complex diplomatic documents or analyzing international trade agreements. He was trying to piece together a puzzle with potentially missing pieces. Lady Catherine, Alexander said formally, please summon Sergeant Morrison immediately. I want to speak with him about exactly what orders he received and from whom. Of course, Your Majesty, Lady Catherine replied, reaching for her phone. While they waited for the sergeant to arrive, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Elena remained seated on the bench, feeling somewhat like an observer to her own drama. Isabel moved to stand closer to Alexander, and Elena noticed that her sister-in-law's hand briefly touched Alexander's arm in a gesture that seemed both supportive and possessive. Alexander, Isabel said softly, I hope you know that I would never deliberately exclude Elena from anything. She's your sister, which makes her my sister too. I value her presence in our family. Elena heard the words and recognized them as exactly what she should say in this situation, but something about the delivery felt rehearsed. Or perhaps Elena was simply becoming paranoid after the morning's events. Sergeant Morrison appeared on the path within a few minutes, walking quickly and looking decidedly uncomfortable. Elena could see the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he was maintaining his formal demeanor. This was clearly not a conversation he was looking forward to. Your Majesty, Sergeant Morrison said, bowing slightly to Alexander before nodding respectfully to Isabel and Elena. Sergeant Morrison, Alexander began without preamble. I need you to tell me exactly what instructions you received this morning regarding my sister's attendance at the family council meeting. The sergeant glanced quickly at Isabel before answering. Your Majesty, I received a phone call at approximately 7:30 this morning from someone identifying herself as Lady Catherine. The caller instructed me that Princess Elena would not be attending today's meeting and that I should inform her that her presence was not required. Elena looked quickly at Lady Catherine, who appeared genuinely shocked. Sergeant Morrison, I made no such phone call. I was in my quarters until 9 o'clock this morning, and I spoke with no one from the guard detail. The caller specifically identified herself as Lady Catherine from Queen Isabel's office, Sergeant Morrison insisted. Sergeant Morrison, did you recognize the voice of the caller? I thought I did, Your Majesty. The voice sounded like Lady Catherine, and she knew specific details about the meeting schedule that suggested she had legitimate authority to make such changes. Elena felt a chill as the implications of this revelation sank in. Someone had deliberately impersonated Lady Catherine to ensure Elena's exclusion from the meeting. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. It was a calculated deception. Did you follow standard protocol for verifying the authenticity of the order? Alexander asked, Sergeant Morrison looked uncomfortable. I'm afraid I did not, Your Majesty. The caller seemed to have appropriate knowledge and authority, and the request didn't seem. That is, it didn't occur to me that verification would be necessary for what seemed like a routine scheduling change. Elena could see that the sergeant was beginning to realize the severity of the situation. What had seemed like a simple instruction from a senior staff member was now revealed to be something much more serious. Alexander was quiet for a moment, clearly processing this information. Elena watched his face carefully, knowing that his next words would be crucial in determining how this situation would be handled. Sergeant Morrison, in the future, all changes to protocol regarding any member of the royal family must be verified through official channels, regardless of who appears to be making the request. You're dismissed for now, but I may have additional questions later. Isabel, I need to ask you directly. Do you have any knowledge of who might have orchestrated this morning's events? Isabel's response was immediate and seemed genuine. Alexander, I swear to you that I had no knowledge of any plan to exclude Elena from the meeting. I'm as confused and disturbed by this as you are. Elena studied her sister-in-law's face carefully, looking for any signs of deception. Isabel appeared sincere, but Elena had learned over the years that appearances could be deceiving, especially in royal circles where image management was a crucial skill. There's something else we need to consider, Elena said quietly, speaking for the first time since the interrogation had begun. All eyes turned to her, and she took a breath before continuing. This morning's incident didn't happen in isolation. It's part of a larger pattern of my gradual exclusion from royal duties and family events. Someone has been systematically undermining my position for months, and today was just the most obvious example. Alexander's jaw tightened. You think this was planned? That someone has been deliberately targeting you? I think someone wants me to have less influence in the royal family, Elena said carefully. Whether that's because they see me as a threat to their own position, or because they have some other agenda, I don't know. But today's incident required inside knowledge, careful timing, and the willingness to engage in outright deception. That suggests someone with both access and motivation. Isabel looked genuinely distressed by this suggestion. Elena, the thought that someone in our household would engage in such behavior is horrifying. We need to find out who's responsible and ensure they face appropriate consequences. Elena nodded, though she noticed that Isabel had said our household rather than my staff when referring to the potential culprit. It was a small detail, but in Elena's experience, small details often revealed important truths. Alexander was clearly struggling with the implications of the situation. Elena could see him weighing various possibilities, trying to determine who among his trusted advisors and staff members might be capable of such calculated manipulation. For now, Alexander said finally, we're going to proceed as if this was an isolated incident perpetrated by someone with access to privileged information. Elena, I want you to return to the council meeting immediately. We'll postpone today's agenda to next week so that you can be properly briefed on everything that was discussed in your absence. That's not necessary, Elena began, but Alexander cut her off. It absolutely is necessary. You're my sister and a vital member of this family. Today's incident should never have happened, and I won't allow your position to be undermined again. As they walked back toward the palace, Elena found herself feeling simultaneously relieved and apprehensive. The immediate crisis had been resolved, and Alexander had clearly demonstrated his support for her. However, the underlying problem remained. Someone in their inner circle had orchestrated her humiliation, and until that person was identified, Elena knew she would have to be constantly vigilant. Moreover, the incident had revealed just how vulnerable she was to this type of manipulation. Her position in the royal family, which she had always taken for granted, was apparently not as secure as she had believed. Someone had successfully excluded her from an important meeting simply by making a phone call, and it had nearly worked perfectly. As they approached the palace entrance, Elena noticed that the guards who had turned her away earlier were no longer at their posts. Whether they had been reassigned or simply rotated to other duties, Elena couldn't tell, but Their absence felt symbolic of how quickly things could change in the royal household. The golden doors that had been closed to her just an hour earlier now stood open, ready to welcome her back into the heart of her family's world. But as Elena walked through those doors, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Hashtag Royal Drama Story. Part 3. The council chamber fell silent as Alexander, Elena, and Isabel entered together. Elena could feel the weight of curious stares from the assembled advisors, ministers, and court officials who had been waiting for over an hour without explanation for the delay. The massive mahogany table that dominated the room was lined with familiar faces, each one displaying varying degrees of concern, confusion, and barely concealed curiosity about the morning's unprecedented events. Minister Harrison, the elderly head of domestic affairs who had served 3 generations of the royal family, half rose from his chair as they entered. "Your Majesty, we were beginning to worry. Is everything all right?" "Please, everyone remain seated," Alexander said, his voice carrying the authority that came naturally to him after 5 years on the throne. "We apologize for the delay, and we appreciate your patience. Before we continue with today's agenda, I need to address a serious incident that occurred this morning." Elena took her usual seat at Alexander's right hand, the chair that had been symbolically empty during her exclusion. As she settled into the familiar leather upholstery, she was acutely aware that several people around the table were studying her with intense interest. Lady Margaret Thornton, the protocol advisor, looked particularly perplexed, while Foreign Minister Davidson wore an expression of barely contained curiosity. Isabel moved to her own chair on Alexander's left, and Elena noticed that her sister-in-law's composure seemed perfect, showing no signs of the stress that must surely be affecting her. Elena had to admit, grudgingly, that if Isabel was involved in the morning's deception, she was an extraordinary actress. "This morning," Alexander began, "my sister was denied entry to this meeting by palace guards acting on fraudulent orders. Someone impersonated a senior staff member and deliberately excluded Princess Elena from these proceedings." The reaction around the table was immediate and dramatic. Several advisors gasped audibly, while others leaned forward with expressions of shock and concern. Elena watched their faces carefully, looking for any signs of guilt or prior knowledge, but everyone appeared genuinely surprised by the revelation. "Your Majesty," said Lord Chancellor Pemberton, his weathered face grave with concern, "this is an extremely serious breach of security. If someone has the ability to impersonate staff members and manipulate palace protocols, it represents a significant threat to the integrity of our governmental processes." "Agreed," Alexander replied. "Lady Catherine is conducting a full investigation into how this was possible and who might have been responsible. In the meantime, we're implementing immediate security protocol reviews." Elena noticed that several people glanced in Isabel's direction when Alexander mentioned the investigation. Whether they were looking for her reaction or wondering about her potential involvement, Elena couldn't tell, but the subtle shift in attention was unmistakable. "If I may, Your Majesty," interjected General Morrison, the head of palace security and the father of Sergeant Morrison. "I'd like to review all communication logs from this morning and conduct interviews with anyone who had advanced knowledge of today's meeting details." "Please coordinate with Lady Catherine on that," Alexander said. "I want this investigation to be thorough and transparent." As the formal meeting resumed, Elena tried to focus on the various reports and discussions, but she found her attention repeatedly drawn to observing the behavior of those around the table. The morning's events had made her realize how little she actually knew about the motivations and loyalties of some of the people with whom she worked closely. Minister Harrison was presenting updates on the agricultural situation in the northern provinces, a topic that normally would have captured Elena's complete attention given her particular expertise in rural development. However, today she found herself studying the faces of Lady Catherine's assistants, wondering which of them might have had the access and knowledge necessary to orchestrate her exclusion. During a brief recess, Foreign Minister Davidson approached Elena with obvious concern. Davidson had been a family friend for over 15 years, and his daughter had gone to school with Elena. "Elena, I hope you know that if I had any idea what was happening this morning, I would have intervened immediately," he said quietly. "The thought that someone would deliberately exclude you from these proceedings is absolutely appalling." "Thank you, David. I appreciate that," Elena replied, though she couldn't help wondering if his expression of support was genuine or politically motivated. The morning's events had made her question assumptions she had never thought to examine before. "Do you have any theories about who might have done this?" Davidson asked, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. Elena hesitated. She had been thinking about little else for the past 2 hours, but she wasn't ready to share her suspicions with anyone yet, even someone as trusted as Davidson. "I honestly don't know," she said finally. "It would have to be someone with detailed knowledge of palace protocols and meeting schedules, someone who could impersonate Lady Catherine convincingly, and someone who had a reason to want me excluded from today's discussions." Davidson nodded thoughtfully. "The list of people with that kind of access is unfortunately quite long. Nearly everyone in this room would qualify, along with dozens of staff members and advisors." Elena realized that Davidson was right, and the thought was unsettling. The royal household operated on trust and established relationships built over years or even decades. The idea that someone within that trusted circle was actively working against her was profoundly disturbing. When the meeting resumed, Elena noticed that Isabel was taking more active role in the discussions than usual. The Queen offered opinions on trade negotiations, cultural programs, and diplomatic initiatives with a confidence and knowledge that suggested extensive preparation. Elena had to acknowledge that Isabel was clearly taking her royal duties seriously and was becoming increasingly informed about complex governmental issues. However, Elena also noticed that several of Isabel's comments seemed designed to subtly undermine or redirect initiatives that Elena had previously championed. When Elena suggested expanding the cultural exchange program with neighboring kingdoms, Isabel politely questioned whether the resources might be better allocated to domestic programs. When Elena recommended a particular approach to the upcoming trade negotiations, Isabel offered alternative strategies that would minimize Elena's traditional role in diplomatic preparations. None of Isabel's interventions were inappropriate or obviously hostile, but taken together they seemed designed to diminish Elena's influence and expertise. Elena began to wonder if the morning's dramatic exclusion was just the most obvious example of a more subtle and ongoing campaign to marginalize her position. Alexander seemed unaware of these undercurrents, responding to both Elena's and Isabel's suggestions with equal consideration. Elena realized that her brother might not recognize the subtle power dynamics at play, particularly given his natural desire to support both his sister and his wife. As the meeting progressed, Elena found herself paying particular attention to Lady Catherine, who was taking detailed notes and occasionally whispering with her assistants. Elena had always trusted Lady Catherine completely, but the morning's events had forced her to reconsider all of her assumptions about loyalty and trustworthiness within the royal household. Lady Catherine was one of the few people who would have had both the knowledge and the authority necessary to orchestrate Elena's exclusion. She knew the meeting details, understood palace protocols, and could easily have arranged for the deceptive phone call. Moreover, as Isabel's chief aide, she might feel that her primary loyalty lay with the Queen rather than with Elena. However, Lady Catherine's shocked reaction to Sergeant Morrison's testimony had seemed genuine, and Elena had worked with her for over 3 years without any indication of duplicity or hidden agendas. The possibility that Lady Catherine was involved was deeply troubling, but Elena knew she couldn't dismiss it entirely. During another brief recess, Elena stepped outside onto the terrace adjacent to the council chamber. Isabel's green eyes seemed clear and direct, and her expression appeared genuinely sympathetic. "It was certainly unexpected," Elena replied carefully. "I want you to know that I'm committed to finding out who was responsible for this," Isabel continued. "And I hope you believe me when I say that I had nothing to do with it. The thought that someone would use my name or my office to target you is deeply disturbing." Elena felt a flicker of something that might have been relief. If Isabel was being truthful, then Elena's growing suspicions about her sister-in-law were unfounded, and the real threat was coming from someone else entirely. "I want to believe that," Elena said honestly. "But I have to ask you directly, have you been deliberately trying to reduce my role in royal affairs? Some of the changes over the past few months have made me feel increasingly marginalized." Isabel was quiet for a moment, and Elena could see her carefully considering her response. "Elena, I'll be completely honest with you. When I married Alexander, I was overwhelmed by the complexity of royal duties and protocols. I may have been overly eager to establish my own role and authority, and in doing so, I might have inadvertently encroached on areas that were traditionally yours." Elena appreciated the admission, even if it didn't fully address her concerns. However, Isabel continued, "Any changes I've made have been about establishing my own effectiveness as queen, not about undermining your position. You're Alexander's sister, and that makes you family to me. I would never deliberately try to hurt or exclude you." Elena wanted to believe Isabel's words, but the patterns she had observed over the past few months were difficult to dismiss as mere inadvertent encroachment. "Isabel, can I ask you something else?" Elena said. "Do you have any theories about who might have orchestrated this morning's events? You know your staff better than anyone, and you understand the palace dynamics." Isabel frowned thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that constantly since we discovered what happened. The person would need detailed knowledge of palace protocols, access to information about today's meeting, and the ability to impersonate Lady Catherine convincingly enough to fool Sergeant Morrison." "That's a fairly specific set of requirements," Elena observed. "Yes, and it's troubling how many people within our household would meet those criteria," Isabel agreed. "But there's something else to consider. This wasn't just about excluding you from one meeting. If your theory is correct that this is part of a larger pattern, then we're looking for someone with a sustained agenda against you." Elena nodded, appreciating that Isabel seemed to be taking her concerns seriously. "Who benefits from reducing your influence?" Isabel asked. "Who might see you as an obstacle to their own advancement or agenda?" It was a question Elena had been asking herself repeatedly, and the answers she was beginning to consider were deeply unsettling. Several people within the royal household might benefit from her marginalization, and some of them were people she had trusted implicitly. As they returned to the council chamber for the final session of the meeting, Elena felt that her relationship with Isabel had shifted in a positive direction. Whether the queen was genuinely innocent of involvement in the morning's events remained to be seen, but her willingness to engage in honest conversation was encouraging. However, Elena also realized that the investigation into the morning's incident was likely to reveal uncomfortable truths about loyalty, ambition, and deception within the royal household. Someone she trusted had betrayed that trust in a calculated and sophisticated manner, and discovering their identity was going to be both necessary and painful. The remainder of the meeting proceeded without incident, but Elena was acutely aware that the real drama was just beginning. Someone within their trusted inner circle had declared war on her position and influence, and Elena knew she would need to be prepared for whatever revelations the investigation might uncover. As the meeting concluded and the various officials began to depart, Elena noticed Lady Catherine approaching with a folder in her hands and an expression of grim determination on her face. "Your Majesty, Princess Elena," Lady Catherine said formally, "I have some preliminary findings from this morning's investigation that I think you should see immediately." Elena felt her heart rate increase as she prepared to learn who had betrayed her trust and orchestrated her humiliation. Whatever Lady Catherine had discovered, Elena suspected it was going to change everything. #Royal Drama Story. Part 4. Lady Catherine's preliminary findings led to a private meeting in Alexander's study, a room that had served as the nerve center for royal decision-making for 3 generations. The oak-paneled walls were lined with portraits of previous monarchs, their painted eyes seeming to watch over the unfolding drama with silent judgment. Elena settled into one of the leather armchairs facing Alexander's desk. while Isabel chose to remain standing near the window, her silhouette framed by the late afternoon sunlight. The investigation revealed some disturbing information. Lady Catherine began, opening her folder with deliberate care. I've traced the phone call that Sergeant Morrison received this morning, and the results are complicated. Alexander leaned forward in his chair, his expression tense. What did you discover? The call was made from an internal palace phone line at 7:28 this morning, Lady Catherine said, consulting her notes. Specifically, it came from a phone in the East Wing library. Elena felt a chill run through her. The East Wing library was rarely used except by a select few staff members and family. It wasn't a location that would have foot traffic or witnesses during the early morning hours. Who has access to that area at that time? Elena asked. That's where it becomes complicated, Lady Catherine replied. The East Wing is accessible to senior staff members, family members, and anyone with appropriate security clearance. However, the library itself requires a specific access code that only 12 people possess. Isabel turned from the window, her face pale. 12 people. The royal family, myself, my 2 senior assistants, the head librarian, General Morrison, the protocol advisor, and... Lady Catherine hesitated for a moment. Lord Blackwood. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Lord Blackwood had been their mother's private secretary for over 20 years before becoming Elena's chief advisor after Queen Margaret's death. Elena had trusted him completely, considering him almost family. The suggestion that he might be involved in this morning's betrayal was almost incomprehensible. There must be some mistake, Elena said immediately. Lord Blackwood would never. I understand your shock, Lady Catherine interrupted gently. However, there's more. When I reviewed the security logs for the East Wing, I discovered that Lord Blackwood entered the building at 6:45 this morning, nearly 2 hours earlier than his usual arrival time. Alexander's expression had grown very serious. Did you speak with Lord Blackwood about this? I attempted to reach him this afternoon, but his office informed me that he called in sick and wouldn't be available for the remainder of the day. When I called his residence, his housekeeper said he had left town unexpectedly on personal business. Elena felt as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Lord Blackwood's sudden absence, combined with the evidence placing him in the East Wing at the crucial time, painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. This doesn't make sense, Elena said, though her voice lacked conviction. Why would Lord Blackwood want to exclude me from the family meeting? He's worked for our family for decades. His loyalty has never been questioned. I've been thinking about that, Isabel said quietly from her position by the window. Elena, you mentioned earlier that someone has been systematically undermining your position for months. Could Lord Blackwood have been involved in those other incidents as well? Elena's mind raced as she considered the possibility. Lord Blackwood certainly had access to her schedule, her responsibilities, and detailed knowledge of royal protocols. He would have known exactly how to manipulate situations to gradually reduce her influence without making it obvious. The state dinner planning, Elena said slowly, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit together in her mind. Lord Blackwood was the one who suggested that I might be overextended and should consider reducing my responsibilities. Alexander frowned. When was this? About 2 months ago. He presented it as concern for my well-being, suggesting that I was taking on too much and should focus on my core duties. At the time, it seemed like thoughtful advice from someone who cared about me. And the children's hospital opening? Isabel asked. Elena's heart sank as she remembered. Lord Blackwood was the one who informed me that there had been a scheduling conflict and that arrangements had been made for you to attend instead, Isabel. He said he had spoken directly with your office and that everything had been coordinated. Lady Catherine made notes as Elena spoke, her expression growing increasingly grave. This suggests a pattern of deception spanning several months, with Lord Blackwood potentially manipulating situations to gradually reduce Princess Elena's public profile and responsibilities. But why? Alexander asked, voicing the question that Elena had been afraid to examine too closely. What could Lord Blackwood possibly gain from undermining Elena's position? The room fell silent as they all considered the implications. Elena found herself thinking about Lord Blackwood's demeanor over the past few months, trying to identify signs that she might have missed. Had there been hints of resentment or ambition that she had failed to recognize? "There's something else," Lady Catherine said reluctantly. "When I reviewed Lord Blackwood's recent communications and activities, I discovered that he has been in contact with representatives from the Astoria royal court." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The Kingdom of Astoria was Valdoria's primary political and economic rival, and relations between the two nations have been tense for years. Any unauthorized communication with Asturian representatives would be considered a serious security breach at minimum, and potentially treasonous, depending on the nature of the conversations. "What kind of contact?" Alexander asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I don't have complete details yet, but preliminary evidence suggests that Lord Blackwood has been providing information about Valdorian royal family activities and political positions to Asturian intelligence operatives." Elena sank back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the betrayal. Lord Blackwood hadn't just been undermining her position within the royal family. He had been selling information to a foreign power. The morning's humiliation suddenly seemed trivial compared to the national security implications of what Lady Catherine was describing. "How long has this been going on?" Isabel asked. "Based on what I've been able to trace so far, at least 6 months, possibly longer," Lady Catherine replied. "It appears that Lord Blackwood initially made contact with Asturian representatives through what seemed like legitimate diplomatic channels, but the relationship evolved into something much more serious." Alexander stood and began pacing behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture Elena recognized from their father. When her father had paced like that, it usually meant that someone was about to face very serious consequences. "Lady Catherine, I want you to contact General Morrison immediately," Alexander said. "Lord Blackwood is to be located and detained for questioning. I also want a complete security review of all royal family communications and activities over the past year." "Of course, Your Majesty," Lady Catherine replied, though Elena could see the distress in her eyes. The discovery of a high-level security breach within the royal household was the kind of crisis that could damage the monarchy's credibility for years. "There's one more thing we need to consider," Isabel said carefully. "If Lord Blackwood has been feeding information to the Astorians, they may know about today's investigation. He could already be warning them that his activities have been discovered." Elena realized that Isabel was right, and the implications were staggering. If Lord Blackwood had indeed fled to Astoria or was in communication with his handlers, he could potentially cause significant damage to Valdorian interests even after his betrayal had been exposed. "General Morrison needs to coordinate with our intelligence services immediately," Alexander said. "We need to know exactly what information Lord Blackwood had access to and what he might have compromised." As Lady Catherine departed to begin implementing Alexander's instructions, Elena found herself alone with her brother and sister-in-law for the first time since the morning's crisis had begun. The revelation of Lord Blackwood's betrayal had fundamentally changed her understanding of recent events and raised troubling questions about whom she could trust in the future. "Elena, I'm so sorry," Alexander said, settling back into his chair with visible exhaustion. "Lord Blackwood's betrayal is a personal attack on you and a breach of trust that goes back decades. I can't imagine how you must be feeling." Elena was surprised to discover that she felt almost numb rather than angry or hurt. The magnitude of the deception was so overwhelming that her emotional response seemed to have shut down entirely. "I keep thinking about all the conversations I had with him," Elena said quietly. "All the confidential information I shared, all the family matters we discussed. How much of that did he pass along to the Astorians?" "We'll find out," Alexander promised. "And we'll make sure that anyone who receives stolen information faces appropriate consequences." Isabel moved away from the window and sat down in the chair adjacent to Elena's. "Elena, I want to apologize for my part in this situation. Even if I wasn't deliberately involved in Lord Blackwood's scheme, I may have inadvertently made it easier for him to marginalize your position. Some of the changes I made to protocols and responsibilities might have provided cover for his activities. Elena looked at her sister-in-law with new appreciation. Isabel's willingness to acknowledge her role in the situation, even unintentional, suggested a level of integrity that Elena had previously questioned. "I think we all need to accept that we were deceived by someone we trusted," Elena replied. Lord Blackwood was incredibly skilled at manipulation. He made his suggestions and interventions seem reasonable and well-intentioned. "The question now is how we move forward," Alexander said. "We need to rebuild security protocols, restore Elena's proper role in royal affairs, and manage the diplomatic fallout from this incident." Elena nodded, though she was still processing the personal impact of the betrayal. She had lost not just a trusted advisor, but someone she had considered almost family. The realization that Lord Blackwood had been systematically deceiving her for months, possibly years, was going to require significant emotional recovery. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elena said after a moment. "This morning's events have made me realize how vulnerable my position actually was. If one person could so effectively undermine my role and influence, then we need to examine the structural issues that made that possible." Alexander frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that my position in the royal family has been based largely on tradition and assumption rather than clearly defined authority and responsibilities. That made it easy for Lord Blackwood to gradually erode my influence without anyone noticing the pattern." Isabel nodded thoughtfully. Elena's right. If her role had been more formally established, it would have been much harder for someone to manipulate situations the way Lord Blackwood did. Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward Isabel for supporting her analysis. Despite the morning's tensions and mutual suspicions, it seemed that the crisis had ultimately brought them closer together rather than driving them apart. "What are you proposing?" Alexander asked. "I think we need to formalize the roles and responsibilities of all senior family members," Elena said. "Clear job descriptions, defined authorities, and established protocols that can't be easily manipulated by ambitious staff members." Alexander considered this suggestion seriously. "That makes sense, especially given what we've learned today. It would also help prevent future security breaches by making unauthorized changes to protocols more obvious." As the evening light began to fade outside the study windows, Elena reflected on how dramatically the day had changed her understanding of her position within the royal family. She had begun the morning feeling secure in her role and relationships, only to discover that she was far more vulnerable than she had realized. However, the crisis had also revealed strengths and loyalties that she hadn't fully appreciated before. Alexander's immediate support when he learned of her exclusion demonstrated his unwavering commitment to their sibling relationship. Isabel's willingness to examine her own role in the situation and work collaboratively toward solutions suggested that their relationship could become stronger than Elena had previously imagined. Most importantly, Elena had learned that she couldn't take her position for granted or assume that others would always act in her best interests. The experience had been painful, but it had also taught her valuable lessons about vigilance, independence, and the importance of clearly established authority. As they prepared to leave Alexander's study, Elena felt cautiously optimistic about the future. Lord Blackwood's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also provided an opportunity to strengthen the royal family's internal dynamics and security protocols. The crisis that had begun with her humiliating exclusion from family meeting had ultimately revealed deeper problems that could now be addressed properly. "One more thing," Elena said as they reached the door. "Tomorrow morning, I want to personally review all of my current responsibilities and authorities. It's time for me to take a more active role in defining my own position rather than simply accepting what others think is appropriate." Alexander smiled for the first time since the morning's events had begun. "That sounds like an excellent plan. And, Elena, next time someone tries to exclude you from a family meeting, they're going to have to go through me first." Elena smiled back, feeling that despite the day's revelations and betrayals, her relationship with her family was stronger than it had been in months. The road ahead would require careful rebuilding of trust and security, but Elena was confident that they would emerge from this crisis as a more unified and resilient royal family. The shocking moment that had begun with denial and exclusion had ultimately led to discovery, understanding, and the promise of positive change. Sometimes, Elena reflected, the most painful experiences could produce the most valuable outcomes.